My name is Jessica, and I have a story to tell. A story that may shock some of you, and perhaps even cause others to question my choices. But this is my truth. It's one I've kept hidden for so long, and I've finally decided it's time to come clean. I have to start by saying that, no, this isn't some wild tale of outrageous behavior or explicit scandal. This is about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection went horribly wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning. My husband Richard and I have been married for almost 10 years. We met when we were both fresh out of university. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and have everyone's attention in an instant. I fell in love with him, and the early days of our relationship were like something out of a romantic film. It was perfect. Fast forward a few years and life wasn't so picture perfect. Richard's work took him away from home more often than not. His job was demanding, and he was constantly traveling for business meetings, conferences, and networking events. While I understood that his work was important, his absence took a toll on our marriage. We became distant, barely speaking for days at a time, and when we did speak, it was usually superficial conversation. You know, the usual "how was your day?" and "what's for dinner?" stuff. But underneath it all, I was lonely. I craved attention, companionship, and someone to fill the void Richard had unwittingly left in my life. That's when things started to change. We lived on a quiet, peaceful farm just outside the city. One of the things that had drawn us to this place was the space and opportunity to keep animals. We had a few chickens, some goats, and of course our horse, Midnight. Midnight was a beautiful, strong, black stallion with a temperament so gentle that you felt he understood emotions better than most people. I had always loved horses, but Midnight was special. He had been a gift from Richard for our 5th wedding anniversary, a gesture to show how much he cared, even though he couldn't always be there. During the long, lonely days when Richard was away, Midnight became my source of comfort. I would spend hours in the stable, brushing him, talking to him, just being in his presence. It sounds strange, I know, but animals have a way of sensing when you're hurting. Midnight always seemed to know when I was sad or frustrated, and he would nudge me gently with his nose as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." In time, these moments with Midnight became the highlight of my days. I found myself pouring my heart out to him, telling him things I couldn't even say to my husband. Midnight was patient, never judgmental, and always there. It was as if he had become the emotional support I was missing. I know what you're thinking. How can I compare a horse to my husband? But you must understand that Richard was absent and Midnight was all I had. The turning point came one summer evening. Richard was out of town as usual, and I was feeling particularly low. I had just finished talking to him, and once again it felt like we were two strangers living separate lives. I went out to the stables, hoping to find some peace with Midnight. As I brushed his coat, I began to talk to him as I always did. But something was different this time. I was venting about my frustrations, my loneliness, and how disconnected I felt from Richard. I rambled on, not even thinking about what I was saying, when I suddenly realized that I was talking about Midnight in a way that made my heart race. I caught myself, shook my head, and laughed it off. "Jessica, you're being ridiculous," I said to myself. Midnight was a horse, a magnificent one, yes, but still a horse. I tried to brush off the strange thoughts that had begun to creep into my mind, but as the days went on, I found myself returning to the stable more often, staying longer than I should have, and feeling a growing sense of attachment to Midnight that I couldn't explain. I felt guilty. How could I be so emotionally invested in an animal when I had a husband? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the bond became. Midnight was always there, and Richard wasn't. The truth is, I didn't cheat in the way you might expect. There was no physical betrayal, no affair in the traditional sense. But emotionally, I had crossed a line. I had begun to confide in Midnight in ways that should have been reserved for my husband. Then, one evening, it all came crashing down. Richard came home unexpectedly from one of his trips. I didn't hear him pull into the driveway, and I was in the stable as usual, with Midnight. I didn't realize how much time I had spent there, how much I had become absorbed in this strange emotional attachment. When Richard came into the stables, he found me standing next to Midnight, whispering to him. I didn't notice Richard until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice was sharp, full of confusion and suspicion. His eyes darted between me and Midnight, as if trying to piece together the scene before him. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this without sounding crazy? Richard stood there, staring at me, waiting for an explanation that I didn't know how to give. How could I even begin to explain the emotional whirlwind I had been caught up in? The silence in the stable seemed to go on forever, broken only by the soft snort of Midnight, who was completely unaware of the storm that had just blown in. "Jessica, what the hell is going on?" Richard asked again, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I instinctively stepped back and put a hand on Midnight's side, as if he could somehow shield me from the confrontation that was about to happen. "It's not what you think, Richard," I stammered, though I wasn't even sure what he was thinking. How could he explain what he was seeing when I barely understood it myself? He shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Then tell me, because I come home early and find you here, whispering to our horse as if he's... I don't even know what. What am I supposed to think?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain the emotional connection I had developed with Midnight without sounding completely insane. "Richard, you've been gone a lot lately," I began, seeing the frustration in his eyes. "I know it's your job, and I know you work hard for us, but I've been lonely, and Midnight. He's been there for me. He listened to me when I didn't have anyone else." He threw up his hands in despair. "He's a horse, Jessica." "You talk like he's a person." I winced at his words, but I couldn't deny that he was right. "I know," I whispered, "but he was there when you weren't. I started talking to him because I didn't have anyone else. It got out of hand." Richard looked at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "So what? You're saying you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words sounded absurd even to me, but the reality of the situation wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to, and Midnight was there." He shook his head again, clearly struggling to take it all in. "So what are you telling me? That you love him? That you'd rather be with him than with me?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could tell there was a deep sense of betrayal beneath the anger. "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard, but I was lonely and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away and paced the small stable. "This is madness. I don't even know how to wrap my head around it. I come home and this is what I find? My wife confessing to some kind of emotional affair with our horse?" I stood there helpless, not knowing how to fix the situation. "Richard, please, it wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical, nothing inappropriate. I was lost in loneliness." He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, his back to me, trying to collect his thoughts. Then he finally spoke. "Do you know how crazy this sounds, Jessica? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to come to this." Richard turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you felt this way?" "I tried," I said, my voice shaking, "but every time I brought it up, you were too busy or too tired or just distracted, and I finally gave up. I thought maybe that was the way things were going to be, so I found comfort in Midnight. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but he was there for me in a way that you weren't." He sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you felt that way. I thought we were fine." "We weren't," I replied quietly. "But I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work and I didn't want to seem needy. But the truth is that I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband, and when you weren't there, I turned to midnight." There was a long silence between us as we both stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice much softer this time. "I don't know what to do, Jessica. I don't know how to go on from here." I took a deep breath, feeling the tears spill over onto my cheeks. "I don't either," I admitted. "But I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I love you, and I don't want to lose you." Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "I love you too, Jessica, but this is going to take time." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." He sighed again, finally stepping closer to me. "We need to talk about this, really talk about everything, not just midnight, but us. Where we went wrong and how we can fix it." I nodded, reaching out to take his hand again, this time feeling him squeeze it back. "I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to make things right." As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And with that, Jessica and Richard began the long process of healing their marriage, learning to reconnect and rediscovering the love that had once brought them together.